The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows through the hallway windows of Westfield High School. A 15-year-old girl with soft blonde curls clutched her books tightly, hurrying toward the main exit. Suddenly, a tall boy blocked her path, his hand shooting out to grab a fistful of her hair, yanking hard enough to make her gasp. At the far end of the corridor, a man in a faded military green shirt had just arrived to pick up his daughter. Without hesitation, he strode forward, placing himself between the girl and her tormentor. Marcus Hayes stood in the modest kitchen of his rented home, the morning light filtering through worn curtains as he prepared breakfast with practiced efficiency. At 35, his movements carried the precision of his 12 years in Special Forces, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, countless classified missions that would never see the light of day. The scars on his forearms told stories he couldn't share, memories etched in flesh rather than words. His calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness as he flipped eggs in the pan, a simple ritual that anchored him to this new life. So different from the one he'd known in uniform, the small house might have been a far cry from military barracks. But he'd made it a home for himself and Emma, filling it with photographs of happier times, most featuring a woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile who'd been gone 3 years now. Emma bounded down the stairs, her long brown hair tied in a high ponytail that swung with each step. At 15, she possessed her mother's delicate features, but her father's unwavering spirit. She'd inherited more than just his stubborn chin and determined gaze. She'd absorbed his sense of justice, his inability to stand by when someone needed help. The loss of her mother to cancer had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. There was a depth in her blue eyes that her classmates couldn't understand. A maturity born from grief transformed into strength. She grabbed a piece of toast, kissing her father's cheek with the casual affection that had become their morning routine. Marcus worked nights as a security guard at a downtown office building, a job that paid just enough to keep them afloat. He never complained about the long hours or the monotony. Military discipline had taught him to find purpose in routine, strength in simplicity. Across town, in the affluent North District where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets between impressive houses, Lily Patterson sat alone at a vast dining table. The morning sun illuminated her pale blonde curls, making them glow like spun gold. But her gray eyes remained distant, focused on something beyond the expensive china and crystal glasses. 2 weeks in Westfield, and she still felt like a ghost walking through someone else's life. Her mother, Brigadier General Sarah Patterson, sat across from her in a crisp uniform that seemed to repel even the smallest speck of dust. Sarah's face maintained the controlled expression she wore like armor. But when she looked at her daughter, something softer flickered in her eyes, a vulnerability she showed to no one else. The general commanded respect from thousands of soldiers at the base 50 miles away. But here, at this table, she was simply a mother watching her child retreat further into herself with each move, each new school, each group of strangers her daughter would have to navigate. Westfield itself was a typical Midwestern town, population just under 20,000, where everyone knew everyone else's business and gossip traveled faster than the wind that swept across the plains. The high school, a sprawling brick building that had stood for 60 years, harbored its own ecosystem of social hierarchies and unspoken rules. Beneath the veneer of academic excellence and championship sports teams lurked a darker truth, a culture of bullying that administrators either couldn't see or chose to ignore. The children of prominent families, those whose parents donated generously to school funds and sat on important boards, operated with near impunity. Their targets were always carefully chosen. The new kids, the different ones, those without connections or protection. Brad Morrison exemplified everything wrong with Westfield High's social structure. As captain of the football team and son of the town's most successful banker, he moved through the hallways like he owned them. His broad shoulders and square jaw might have made him attractive, if not for the cruel twist that seemed permanently etched on his lips. He'd learned early that power came not from strength alone, but from the fear you could instill in others. His favorite targets were the ones who wouldn't fight back, who had no one to defend them. When he'd spotted Lily Patterson that morning new, alone, clearly uncomfortable in her own skin, he'd found his latest source of entertainment. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene, certainly not a security guard who should have known better than to challenge the Morrison family. Marcus had seen Brad's type before. In every conflict zone, he'd served in those who confused fear with respect, who built themselves up by tearing others down. The moment he'd entered that hallway and witnessed Brad gripping Lily's hair, something primal had awakened in him. Not rage, exactly, but a cold certainty that this would stop, now. His approach had been silent, years of training making his footsteps nearly soundless despite his size. When he'd placed his hand on Brad's wrist, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that would force him to release his grip, he'd used exactly the amount of force necessary, no more, no less. Violence, he'd learned, was a tool to be wielded with precision, never emotion. The parking lot stretched before them, autumn leaves scattered across the asphalt like nature's confetti. Emma had immediately moved to Lily's side, her protective instincts as natural as breathing. She recognized something in the other girl's posture, the way she held her books like a shield, the slight tremble in her hands that she tried to hide. Emma had been there herself the previous year, when they'd first arrived in Westfield. The same group, led by Brad, had decided that a security guard's daughter didn't belong in their school. She'd endured weeks of harassment before finally telling her father. And even then, she'd made him promise not to intervene directly. But she'd asked him to teach her to defend herself, and those lessons had changed everything, not because she'd ever had to use them, but because knowing she could had transformed the way she carried herself. That was Brad Morrison, Emma explained quietly as they walked. His family basically owns half the town. His dad's the bank president, his mom's on the school board, and his older brother Derek is even worse, got arrested last year for beating up some college kid at a bar. But the charges mysteriously disappeared. She glanced at Lily, noting how the other girl seemed to shrink into herself at the mention of violence. They think they're untouchable, but they're not. They're just bullies with money. Lily's response was barely a whisper, her voice carrying an accent that suggested she'd lived in many places but belonged to none. It's fine. I'm used to it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that made Marcus's jaw tighten. No 15-year-old should be used to being hurt. He thought of Emma at that age, how fierce and bright she'd been before her mother's illness, how that light had dimmed but never extinguished. Looking at Lily, he saw a light that was barely flickering, threatening to go out entirely. You shouldn't have to be used to it, Emma said firmly, her voice carrying her father's conviction. Nobody should. That's why we have to stick together. Safety in numbers, right, Dad? Marcus nodded, though his attention had shifted to something else, the way Lily held her left arm close to her body, protective and unconscious. His trained eye caught what others might miss, the slight favoring of one side, the careful way she moved that suggested old injuries, maybe more than just physical ones. Marcus noticed how Lily unconsciously kept her distance from him, maintaining at least 3 feet of space at all times. It was a practiced maneuver, the kind of spatial awareness that came from hypervigilance. He'd seen it in combat zones, in soldiers who'd been ambushed one too many times, but this was a 15-year-old girl in suburban America. What had happened to make her so wary? His protective instincts, already engaged, shifted into higher gear. This wasn't just about one incident of bullying. There was a deeper story here, one written in the language of survival, that both he and this young girl seemed to speak fluently. As they reached the edge of the parking lot where paths would diverge, Emma made a decision that would change all their lives. "What's your phone number?" she asked Lily. "I'll text you tonight, and tomorrow morning, we'll meet at the coffee shop on Maple Street before school. It's neutral ground, and they have amazing hot chocolate." The offer hung in the air like an extended hand, waiting to see if it would be accepted or left empty. Lily looked between Emma and Marcus, something shifting in her gray eyes. For a moment, the mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the lonely, frightened girl beneath the careful composure. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of every betrayal, every move, every friend left behind. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Emma's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "Because I know what it's like to be alone. And nobody should have to face Brad Morrison and his goons by themselves." She paused, then added with a small smile. "Plus, anyone who can stay that calm while getting their hair pulled is definitely someone I want as a friend." "You're tougher than you look, Lily Patterson." At the mention of her last name, Marcus noticed Lily stiffen slightly. It was subtle, but unmistakable she hadn't told them her last name. Emma noticed too, looking confused. "How did you know my name?" Lily asked, her voice carefully neutral. Emma shrugged. "Everyone knows the new kids' names. Small-town gossip and all that. Your mom's military, right? That's what I heard anyway." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Lily finally nodded, pulling out her phone with her right hand, while her left remained carefully tucked against her side. As she did, her sleeve rode up just enough for Marcus to see what he'd suspected, not just one bruise, but several, in various stages of healing. And there, on her wrist, a delicate silver bracelet that made his breath catch. He knew that insignia, had seen it only a handful of times in his career. It was the symbol of Delta Force, the Army's most elite special operations unit. Either Lily's father had been one of the most highly trained soldiers in the American military, or someone in her family wanted others to think he was. 703-555-4289, Lily recited, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength. "Text me whenever." I don't really sleep much anyway." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and color rose in her pale cheeks. Emma pretended not to notice, quickly entering the number in her phone with a cheerfulness that didn't quite mask her concern. They parted ways at the corner of Madison and 3rd, Lily walking toward the north side of town with quick, purposeful strides that suggested she knew exactly how long it took to get home and didn't want to be late. Marcus and Emma watched her go, both lost in their own thoughts. "Dad," Emma said quietly, "there's something really wrong there, isn't it?" Marcus nodded slowly, his mind already cataloging what he'd observed, the pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet. "Yeah, baby, there is, but we'll help her, won't we?" Emma's response was immediate and fierce. "Absolutely." The evening came with the kind of Midwestern sunset that painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, beautiful enough to make you forget the ugliness that could hide in such a picturesque town. Marcus and Emma had fallen into their evening routine dinner at Murphy's Diner, where the waitress knew their order by heart and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. They were walking home, Emma chattering about her history project on the Cold War, when the shadows moved. 3 figures emerged from the alley between the hardware store and the pharmacy. Brad Morrison stood in the center, flanked by 2 of his football teammates, Tyler and Jake. But it was the 4th figure, stepping out behind them, that made Marcus's muscles tense in preparation for violence. Derek Morrison was 25, built like his brother but with none of the boyish softness that remained in Brad's face. Prison had hardened him, not officially, of course, since the charges had been dropped. But everyone knew he'd spent 3 months in county lockup before his father's money had worked its magic. His eyes held the flat, dangerous look of someone who'd crossed certain lines and found he liked the other side. Well, Derek drawled, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a predator toying with prey. The hero security guard. "Heard you put your hands on my little brother today." Marcus shifted slightly, positioning himself between the threat and Emma. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. "Your brother was assaulting a student. I stopped him. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with the school administration." The words were reasonable, but his body language spoke a different language. Entirely feet planted, weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. Emma had backed up 3 steps, just as he'd taught her, phone already in hand, though she hadn't lifted it yet. "See, that's where you're wrong." Derek stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the beer on his breath. "In this town, we handle things differently. The Morrison family has been here for 4 generations. You've been here, what, a year? You don't get to come into our town and tell us how to behave." His fists clenched, and Marcus read the telegraph of the punch before it came the slight drop of the shoulder, the shift in weight. The punch never landed. Marcus moved with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful in its efficiency. He redirected Derek's fist past his head, using the man's own momentum to send him stumbling forward. Tyler and Jake rushed in from both sides, but Marcus had already anticipated their attack. A swift kick to Tyler's knee sent him down, not broken but unable to stand. Jake received an open palm to the solar plexus that left him gasping for air on the sidewalk. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. Derek scrambled to his feet, rage and humiliation warring on his face. "You have no idea what you've just done," he snarled. "You don't know who you're messing with. This goes way deeper than you think, soldier boy." The last two words were spit out with particular venom, suggesting Derek knew more about Marcus's background than he should. "My family has connections you can't even imagine. One phone call, and you'll lose that pathetic job. Another call, and maybe..." Child Services starts wondering if a violent vet should be raising a teenage daughter alone. The threat against Emma changed everything. Marcus took one step forward, and something in his expression made Derek stumble backward. When Marcus spoke, his voice was soft, which somehow made it more terrifying. "You can come after me all you want, but if you even think about touching my daughter or using her against me, you'll learn exactly what kind of soldier I used to be. And trust me, son, you don't want that lesson." For a moment, nobody moved. Then sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called the police. Derek's face twisted into an ugly smile. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. He helped his friends to their feet, and they limped away into the darkness. Marcus stood perfectly still until they were gone, then turned to Emma. She was pale but steady, her phone recording everything. "Did you get it all?" he asked. She nodded. "Every word, Dad. Every word." They walked home in silence, both processing what had happened and what it might mean. The Morrison family's influence in Westfield was no idle threat. Marcus had seen how small-town power structures worked, how money and connections could twist justice into something unrecognizable. But he'd also learned that bullies, whether in combat zones or suburban streets, all had the same weakness. They relied on fear, and when someone wasn't afraid, they didn't know what to do. The question was whether standing up to them would protect Emma and Lily or paint bigger targets on all their backs. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill, frost coating the windows like nature's warning of harder times ahead. Marcus had barely slept, his mind running through scenarios, contingency plans, the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive in much more dangerous situations. He was making breakfast when the doorbell rang at exactly 0700 hours military precision timing that made his instincts flare. Emma was still upstairs, getting ready for school. Marcus approached the door carefully, noting the large black SUV parked outside, government plates clearly visible. He opened the door and found himself face to face with a ghost from his past. Brigadier General Sarah Patterson stood on his doorstep in full dress uniform, her posture parade ground perfect despite the early hour. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of shared history hanging between them like a physical presence. Sarah looked exactly as she had 8 years ago in Afghanistan, perhaps a few more lines around her eyes, a streak of premature silver in her dark hair that hadn't been there before. But it was her expression that struck him most, the carefully controlled mask that he remembered from the worst day of both their lives. "Marcus," she said, his name sounding strange on her lips after so many years. "We need to talk." Her voice carried the same authority that had once commanded hundreds of soldiers. But underneath, he heard something else. A mother's fear, carefully controlled, but unmistakable. "May I come in?" Marcus stepped aside wordlessly, his mind racing. Sarah Patterson. Of course. Lily Patterson. How had he not made the connection? But Patterson was a common enough name, and the last he'd heard, Sarah had been stationed in Germany. He led her to the living room, noting how her eyes took in everything: the photographs of Emma and her mother, the folded flag in its triangle case on the mantel, the small signs of a life rebuilt from loss. She sat on the edge of the couch, back straight, hands folded in her lap in a position that looked relaxed but wasn't. "I heard about yesterday," she began without preamble. "Both incidents, the school and the street." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wanted to thank you for protecting Lily. She didn't tell me herself, she never does, but I have my sources." The admission revealed more than she probably intended about the distance between mother and daughter, the gaps that secrets and silence could create, even in the closest relationships. Your daughter's been hurt before, Marcus said. Not a question, but a statement. Those bruises aren't from yesterday. Sarah's composure cracked slightly, pain flashing across her features before she reasserted control. Every base, every school, it's the same. She's always the target. The general's daughter, the new kid, the one who doesn't fit in. I've tried everything. Private schools, base schools, homeschooling. Nothing works. She just withdraws more each time. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Marcus spoke. Kandahar. Operation Iron Shield. December 15th, 2016. Each word was carefully placed, like stepping through a minefield. Sarah's face went pale, her hands clenching involuntarily. You remember, she said softly. Of course, you remember. How could either of us forget? The mission had been classified at the highest levels, a joint special operations raid on a high-value target. Sarah had been the intelligence officer who'd planned it, Marcus the team leader who'd executed it. Everything had gone wrong. Bad intel, an ambush, 3 good soldiers dead, including Sarah's husband, Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who'd insisted on accompanying the raid despite regulations. Marcus had carried James's body out himself, had been the one to hand Sarah her husband's tags, still warm with blood. The official report blamed no one, cited the fog of war, but both Sarah and Marcus knew the truth. The intelligence had been flawed, and the decision to proceed had been hers. I didn't know you were in Westfield, Sarah continued, her voice steadier now that the worst had been said. If I had, I would have. I don't know. Warned you? Apologized? It seems insufficient after all this time. She looked at him directly for the first time since mentioning Kandahar. I heard about your wife. Cancer. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so very sorry. We've both lost too much, Marcus replied, his own voice rougher than intended. But our daughters don't have to carry our ghosts. Lily needs help, Sarah. Not just protection from bullies, but real help. She's showing signs of trauma response that go way beyond normal teenage adjustment issues. He paused, choosing his words carefully, and the Morrisons made threats. Not just against me, but against Emma. They seem to think their family's influence makes them untouchable. Sarah's expression hardened into something Marcus recognized, the look of a commander whose troops had been threatened. The Morrison family, she said slowly, has been a problem for the military community for years. Derek Morrison was dishonorably discharged from the Army 2 years ago for assault and conduct unbecoming. His father pulled strings to keep it quiet, but I have access to records they thought were buried. She stood, smoothing her uniform with practiced precision. They want to play power games? They have no idea what real power looks like. Emma appeared in the doorway, dressed for school but hesitant to interrupt. She looked between her father and the uniformed woman with curious eyes. Sarah's expression softened immediately, and Marcus saw her truly smile for the first time. You must be Emma. Lily spoke about you last night, the first time she's mentioned a friend in over a year. Thank you for your kindness yesterday. Emma, never one to be intimidated by authority, walked into the room with confidence. Is Lily okay? She seemed really shaken up yesterday. Sarah's smile became sadder. She will be, I hope. Especially with friends like you. Emma studied the general with that direct gaze she'd inherited from her father. You're Lily's mom. She has your eyes, just grayer, and the same way of holding herself, like she's ready for an inspection even when she's trying to relax. The observation was so accurate that Sarah actually laughed, a surprised sound that seemed to startle her. You're very perceptive. Your father must be proud. Marcus felt something ease in his chest at the sound of Sarah's laugh. Maybe, just maybe, they could move past their shared tragedy and focus on what mattered now, their daughters. I have a proposition, Sarah said, returning to her professional demeanor but with warmth still in her eyes. Lily needs to learn self-defense, real skills, not just the basic courses they offer at the base. And she needs friends, people she can trust. Would you consider training both girls together? I'll compensate you, of course, and it would give them structured time to bond while learning something valuable. Marcus and Emma exchanged glances, a whole conversation in a look. Emma nodded slightly, and Marcus turned back to Sarah. No compensation necessary. We help because it's right, not for money. But there are conditions. Lily needs to want this, not have it forced on her. And if we do this, we do it properly. Not just physical training, but mental conditioning, confidence building, the whole package. Sarah's relief was palpable. Agreed. And Marcus, the Morrisons. Let me handle the political side. You've already done enough by standing up to them physically. I have ways of applying pressure that won't trace back to you or Emma. The implied threat in her words was clear. She would protect her daughter and those who'd helped her with every resource at her disposal. Later that evening, after Sarah had left and plans had been made, Marcus found himself standing on the back porch, looking out at the small yard where he'd taught Emma her first self-defense moves 3 years ago, right after her mother's diagnosis. They'd needed something to focus on besides hospital visits and treatment schedules, something that made them feel less helpless. The training had become their therapy, their way of proving that they could still protect each other, even when they couldn't protect themselves from loss. Emma joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee, the ritual they'd developed for important conversations. She's not what I expected, Emma said, referring to General Patterson. She's scary in that quiet way, like you. But also sad. Really? Deeply sad. Marcus accepted the coffee, proud of his daughter's emotional intelligence. She lost someone important in the war. Someone she blames herself for losing. It changes you. Carrying that kind of guilt. Is that why you recognized each other? You were there when it happened? Emma asked, showing that perception again. Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak about James Patterson, about the blood and the sand and the sound Sarah had made. When he'd handed her those tags, some stories weren't meant to be shared, even with those you loved most. Do you think we can really help Lily? Emma asked, changing the subject with the intuitive kindness she'd gotten from her mother. She seems so closed off, like she's built walls inside of walls. Marcus put his arm around his daughter, drawing her close. Everyone can be helped if they want to be, and sometimes the people with the highest walls just need someone patient enough to find the door. The first training session was scheduled for Saturday morning, the local gym empty except for them in the early hours. Marcus had arrived early to set up, laying out mats and checking equipment with the methodical precision that never left him. Emma bounced on her toes, excited to share something she loved with a potential friend. When Lily arrived with her mother, she looked smaller somehow in athletic wear, vulnerable without her usual armor of oversized hoodies and hunched shoulders. We'll start with basics, Marcus announced, his instructor voice calm and encouraging. Stance, balance, awareness. The foundation everything else builds on. Emma will demonstrate. Then we'll work through it together. He watched Lily carefully, noting her reluctance to take up space. The way she tried to make herself smaller even when practicing defensive positions. Lily, you have the right to exist. You have the right to defend yourself. The first step is believing that. Sarah watched from the side, having changed from her uniform into civilian clothes that somehow still made her look military. Marcus could see her fighting the urge to intervene, to correct, to command. But she stayed silent, understanding that this needed to be Lily's journey, not hers. Emma proved to be a natural teacher, patient and encouraging, finding ways to make Lily laugh when the tension got too high. She shared her own struggles, the times she'd frozen in fear, the techniques that had helped her push through. As the weeks passed, the Saturday sessions became a cornerstone of all their lives. Lily began to stand straighter, to meet people's eyes instead of staring at the ground. She still flinched at unexpected movements, still kept her guard up, but there were moments of genuine joy when she successfully completed a complex defensive sequence, when Emma's ridiculous jokes caught her off guard, when Marcus's quiet approval made her beam with pride. Sarah began joining the sessions, first as an observer, then as a participant, her own skills sharp despite years behind a desk. The transformation wasn't just physical, Emma and Lily became inseparable at school, their friendship a shield against Brad Morrison's continued harassment. He hadn't given up, but he'd become more careful, especially after his father received a visit from military investigators asking about Derek's discharge and certain financial irregularities in his bank's dealings with government contracts. The message was clear: push too hard, and push would come to shove. Marcus and Sarah began talking after sessions, first about the girls, then about their shared past. Finally, about their individual losses and the challenge of single parenthood. The conversation that had been impossible 8 years ago, in the aftermath of tragedy, became possible in this small gym, with their daughter's laughter echoing off the walls. They were careful, both too damaged to rush into anything, but something was building between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding, respect, the foundation of something that might grow given time. Everything changed on a Thursday evening 6 weeks after that first training session. Marcus was at work, Emma and Lily were studying at the public library, and Sarah was in a meeting at the base. None of them saw the trap being set. Derek Morrison had spent weeks planning, recruiting help from outside town, people who didn't know or care about military connections or small-town consequences. He wanted revenge, and he decided that the best way to hurt Marcus was through the girls. The attack came as Emma and Lily were walking home from the library, taking their usual route through the park. 6 men emerged from the shadows, surrounding them quickly and efficiently. Derek stood back, directing like a general who wouldn't dirty his own hands. Well, the soldier's brat and the general's princess. Perfect. His smile was ugly with anticipation. You're going to send a message for me. But Derek had made a crucial miscalculation. These weren't the same frightened girls from 6 weeks ago. The training had given them more than just physical skills. It had given them confidence, trust in each other, and the knowledge that they didn't have to be victims. When the first man reached for Emma, she reacted instinctively, the moves Marcus had drilled into her flowing naturally. Lily, quiet Lily, who wouldn't hurt a fly, became someone else entirely when Emma was threatened. The weeks of training, the bond they'd formed, the protective instincts that had been dormant all activated at once. The fight was messy, desperate. Nothing like the controlled environment of the gym. But the girls worked together, covering each other's weaknesses, using the terrain to their advantage. They couldn't win against 6 grown men, but they didn't have to. They just had to survive long enough. Emma had triggered the emergency alert on her phone the moment the men appeared, sending their location to her father and Sarah. Lily's scream pierced the night air, deliberate and sustained, drawing attention from nearby houses. Marcus arrived first, having broken every speed limit and probably several laws of physics to get there. What he found stopped him cold for a fraction of a second. His daughter and Lily, backs to each other, still fighting despite being bloodied and exhausted. Then his training took over, and he became something Derek Morrison had never imagined existed: not just a soldier, but a father protecting his young. The 6 men never stood a chance. Marcus moved through them like a force of nature, precise and devastating, each strike calculated to incapacitate without killing, though the restraint cost him. Sarah arrived with military police from the base, having made the decision to involve federal authorities the moment she received Emma's alert. The park was suddenly flooded with lights and uniforms. Derek and his accomplices arrested on federal charges of assaulting military dependents, a charge that carried serious prison time and couldn't be bargained away with small-town influence. As the ambulance arrived to check the girls' injuries, bruises, and cuts, but nothing serious. Thanks to their training and fierce protection of each other, Sarah stood face to face with Derek Morrison. "You thought you were untouchable," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded in actual war zones. "You thought your family's money and influence meant you could hurt our children without consequences. You were wrong. You're about to learn what happens when you threaten military families. Federal prison doesn't care who your father is, and neither do I." Derek's bravado crumbled as the reality set in. His father's money couldn't help him now. He'd crossed a line that put him in federal jurisdiction, and General Patterson had connections that far exceeded small-town influence. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at the 4 of them, 2 soldiers, 2 daughters, a makeshift family forged in conflict, and saw his future disappearing. The aftermath was quieter than expected. The Morrison family, faced with federal investigation into multiple financial crimes uncovered during Derek's arrest, withdrew from public life. Brad transferred to a private school 2 towns over. The bullying at Westfield High didn't disappear overnight, but it lessened significantly when everyone saw what had happened to the untouchable Morrisons. Emma and Lily became symbols of resistance, though they never sought that role. They just wanted to be teenagers, to worry about tests and boys and college applications instead of survival. 3 nights after the attack, Sarah invited Marcus and Emma to dinner at her house. A modest but comfortable home that reflected her military practicality more than her rank's privileges. As they sat around the table, sharing a meal Lily had helped prepare, discovering a love of cooking that surprised everyone, especially herself, the conversation flowed with an ease that would have been impossible just weeks before. Stories were shared, not about the trauma, but about the mundane joys of daily life. Emma teased Lily about her crush on a boy in their chemistry class. Lily fired back about Emma's terrible singing in the car, and the adults watched with something approaching wonder at the resilience of their children. After dinner, while the girls disappeared upstairs to work on homework that probably involved more gossiping than studying, Marcus and Sarah stood on the back deck, looking out at the stars bright in the clear Midwestern sky. "I never thanked you properly," Sarah said quietly. "Not just for the other night, but for everything. For giving Lily her strength back, for showing her she doesn't have to be afraid all the time." Marcus turned to look at her, seeing not the general, but the woman tired, scarred, but still fighting. "You don't need to thank me. Emma needed Lily as much as Lily needed her. They saved each other." He paused, then added, "Maybe we all did." Sarah moved closer, not touching but near enough that he could feel her warmth in the cool night air. "That night in Kandahar, after you brought James back, I thought I'd never forgive myself. I thought I'd never be able to look at you without seeing my failure." She took a breath, steady and determined. "But now I see something different. I see the man who helped my daughter find herself again, who stood between her and harm without hesitation, who showed me that maybe, just maybe, we can build something good from all this loss." The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. From upstairs came the sound of the girls laughing, bright and unrestrained, the sound of healing happening in real time. Marcus thought of his wife, of how she'd made him promise to find happiness again, to not close himself off to love because of loss. Sarah thought of James, of how he'd always said that the best honor to the dead was to live fully for them. "It won't be easy," Marcus said finally. "We're both carrying a lot of damage. The girls need stability, not more upheaval." Sarah nodded, understanding implicit in the gesture. "Then we go slow. We build on friendship first, on this foundation we've already created. The girls are our priority, always. But maybe, along the way, we can find something for ourselves too." 6 months later, spring had transformed Westfield, bringing green to the trees and warmth to the air that had been frozen for so long. The gym where it all started had become a different kind of gathering place. Marcus and Sarah had opened a free self-defense program for local teenagers, teaching not just physical techniques but confidence, awareness, and the knowledge that they had the right to protect themselves. Emma and Lily served as assistant instructors, their story inspiring others who'd felt powerless to find their own strength. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah had evolved slowly, carefully, with respect for their past losses and hope for their future. They weren't trying to replace what they'd lost, that was impossible, but to build something new, something that honored their ghosts while embracing life. The girls, far from being upset by the development, seemed relieved that their parents had found in each other the understanding that only comes from shared experience and mutual respect. On this particular spring evening, as the 4 of them sat around the Patterson dining table that had become as familiar as their own, Lily raised her glass of lemonade in an impromptu toast. "To unexpected families," she said, her voice strong and clear. So different from the whisper it had been that first day. "To the people who stand up for us, who teach us to stand up for ourselves, and who show us that we're worth standing up for." Emma raised her own glass, adding, "To second chances, new beginnings, and the weird way life sometimes puts exactly the right people in your path, at exactly the right time. The adults joined the toast, eyes meeting over their daughters' heads, with the kind of understanding that needed no words. As the evening wound down and the Hayes family prepared to leave, though the definition of family had become beautifully blurred, Sarah walked them to the door. The casual touches between the adults, the easy affection between the girls, the sense of belonging that permeated the space, all spoke to how far they'd come from that day in the high school hallway, when a veteran had stood between a scared girl and her tormentor. "Same time tomorrow?" Lily asked Emma, referring to their planned study session that would inevitably involve more talking than studying. Emma nodded enthusiastically, and the girls hugged with the fierce affection of sisters who'd chosen each other. As Marcus and Emma walked to their car, Sarah called out softly, "Marcus." He turned back, and she smiled, the expression transforming her face from the controlled general to simply a woman who'd found her way back to happiness. "Thank you for everything." Marcus smiled back, the expression reaching his eyes in a way Emma hadn't seen since before her mother's death. "Thank you too, Sarah, for trusting us. For trusting this." The words carried weight beyond their simplicity, acknowledgement of all they'd overcome and all that lay ahead. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Westfield, Emma reached over and squeezed her father's hand. "Mom would be proud of you, Dad. Of us. Of all of this." Marcus squeezed back, his throat tight with emotion. "I think she would be, baby. I really think she would be." The story that had begun with an act of simple human decency protecting someone who needed help had evolved into something neither Marcus nor Sarah could have anticipated. Two broken families had found in each other not just healing but renewal. The ghosts of the past would always be there, honored and remembered, but they no longer defined the future. In a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, the veteran and the general, the two teenage girls who'd become sisters in all but blood, had written their own story of redemption, courage, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people choosing to stand up for what's right. Sometimes, the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from small acts of courage multiplied over time. A hand extended in protection becomes a bond of trust. A moment of intervention becomes a lifetime of connection. And sometimes, just sometimes, saving someone else becomes the very thing that saves you too.